I thank the member for Bowman and I call the Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. Well, I rise in the address and reply to talk about the privilege of once again representing the people of Moncrieff. It is indeed an honour, an absolute honour for me, as it is for each of us in this parliament, to have the opportunity for us to have the opportunity to represent our respective electorates. And I've got to say that I happen to think among the 150 various parts of the country that are represented in this chamber, it'll be no surprise to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I happen to think mine's the best. And the reason why I think mine's the best is because if you were to take a survey of the 23 million Australians, I'd predict that most of them would probably say the Gold Coast, and in particular some of the iconic parts of my electorate, such as Surfers Paradise, probably rank up there as being some of the most quintessential Aussie, but also beautiful parts of the country. And so it is an absolute privilege and honour for me, coming through my 5th election, to stand here at this dispatch box in this parliament and to represent the 100,000 people or so in the seat of Moncrieff. The story of the Gold Coast is an interesting and evolving story, Mr Deputy Speaker. My seat, only created in 1984 and previously served in by the Honourable Cathy Sullivan, has been a place of intense change over the past several decades. It certainly is one of the fastest growing regions in the country. The city of the Gold Coast is now Australia's 6th largest city, as it has been for some time, but continues to be a city that faces a unique number of challenges. Yes, the high pace of population growth presents a number of challenges for us in terms of our critical infrastructure, things like our roads, like public transport, like education. Each of these issues are, of course, important issues in the eyes of each of my constituents, and they're important issues to me. Likewise, the health sector. A big part of the Gold Coast population is our very broad-scale population demographic, but there's a particular bias in some aspects towards those aged 65 and over, and their focus on health is a key area of priority for them, and therefore a key area of priority for me. And I've got to say that the last federal election campaign provided real hope for me, and I know for many of them, as they embraced in large numbers, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Coalition's plans on how to take our nation forward. Because the Gold Coast represents, and in particular Moncrieff, a focal point for so much of the change that we see happening across our community. There was, not that many years ago, a continued focus on what was called the sea change, as people took decisions to move away from regional parts of the country or to move from crowded urban areas and to try to embrace that lifestyle that they thought went along with being someone who lived by the sea. And perhaps Bernard Salt, the famous demographer from KPMG, encapsulated best in his numerous writings over the years about what it is that people were looking for and the values that they represented in part of that quest. And I've got to say that for me, representing a seat like Moncrieff, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's the very recognition that Aussies across this wide brown land do embrace a number of core values, whether it's the chance to have a go, whether it's in that relaxed approach that we have to life, or whether it's the view that each of us is equal and that we should be left basically alone to go about our business. And I see those values played out in a city like the Gold Coast. For so many years it was Australia's holiday playground. It was our premier tourist destination, and it continues to be, Mr Deputy Speaker. But there's been a stark contrast that's been painted over the past several years between the Gold Coast that so many Australians knew and the Gold Coast that existed especially over the last 4 or 5 years. And in particular, the catalyst that drove that change, Mr Deputy Speaker, was the global financial crisis. And we saw in my city, a small business town, a town that has, on a per capita basis, the highest concentration of small businesses in the country. We saw in my town a very significant and strong headwind that continues to last today. Now, the good news is that it's dissipating. But it has been a headwind that has been there solidly and consistently throughout the past 4 or 5 years. And in that respect, Mr Deputy Speaker, the message that I heard from my constituents, they'd say, Steve, please, effect change in Canberra that can help get this nation back on its feet. People would talk to me about their concerns, about the legacy of the past 6 years and how the failed policies of the previous government didn't set up not only the Gold Coast but the nation to be what you would call fighting fit for the challenges that we as a nation, and indeed in my own city, had to face. Gold Coasters, like many Australians, didn't like the fact that under Labor we saw reckless spending to an extreme not previously seen in this nation. The consequence of that spending was, of course, that we saw, in terms of the mid-year economic fiscal outlook, predictions of $123 billion worth of budget deficits over the forward estimates. We saw the debt trajectory of this nation have an endpoint of some $667 billion unless changes were made. And they were the consequences of 6 years of poor economic stewardship by the Australian Labor Party. And although we can talk in broad aggregate numbers, and I can say $123 billion worth of deficits, $667 billion worth of debt, 200,000 extra Australians unemployed, we can talk about those broad aggregate numbers. But what that actually played out on in my seat of Moncrieff, how those big numbers actually played out on the Gold Coast, Mr Deputy Speaker, was to see people struggling, was to see Australians who, in terms of my seat, had a fairly novel approach in some respects to life, that saw them relaxed and comfortable about their life historically, that saw them embrace the lives that go with living alongside what is a magnificent stretch of beach, that saw them have an approach to entrepreneurialism that played out through having the highest concentration of small businesses in the Gold Coast being Australia's small business capital. But the consequence of poor economic stewardship from here in Canberra meant that small businesses were collapsing and folding at a rate we'd not previously seen. The unemployment rate in my city skyrocketed north. We saw investment drive to a halt, whether it was investment in new products or investment in new services, or whether it was investment by those abroad, as in from places outside of the Gold Coast, into property on the Gold Coast. Commercial investment ground to a halt. And we saw, unfortunately, Mr Deputy Speaker, examples of where commercial vacancies ran as high as 50 or 60% in parts of my city. That was the legacy of 6 years of Labor. And so it was for me, in many respects, Mr Deputy Speaker, an opportunity in the last federal election campaign to campaign on hope, to campaign on the Gold Coast and to my constituents on the basis of saying, let's put aside the failed policies of the Australian Labor Party, which have run up unemployment and have run up debt, and let's embrace policies that say we must live within our means, but we must make astute investments that are going to make sure that they provide a dividend yield, not in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, for the people of the Gold Coast for decades to come. That's what they wanted. They didn't like the approach of the Australian Labor Party that saw our single biggest industry, the tourism industry, shackled with billions of dollars of new taxes. They didn't like the approach of the Australian Labor Party that saw our single biggest industry, the tourism industry, incidentally also our single largest employer, having to compete with other nations for Aussie dollars, I should say, Aussie holiday dollars, on the basis of other nations not having to pay a carbon tax, but if they travelled to the Gold Coast to have their holiday, they did have to pay a carbon tax. That was the kind of crazy policy approach that we saw in the Labor Party and from the Labor Party. A policy approach that said, if you take a holiday abroad, you don't pay carbon tax, but if you choose to go to the Gold Coast for your vacation, you do pay a carbon tax. It was a rejection of that kind of approach that my constituents made very clear to me that they wanted, and that is what this government, and I'm certainly very honoured to be part of this government, are focused on delivering. Now, I hope that with the passage of time we'll be able to undo a lot of the damage that was done by the Australian Labor Party, but it will take time. It will take time. So we saw in large numbers the support for the coalition out of the Gold Coast, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that that was reflected across, of course, the length and breadth of the nation. And that's what led to the change of government, so that now, as the Prime Minister has said on so many occasions, Australia's under new management and we're open for business. And I can say that even in the 6 months that it's been since the election, the feeling of change in terms of the approach of the community, in terms of the attitude of its people, and in terms of the general tempo is pronounced, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Gold Coast today is already starting to emerge from the shadows of Labor and the GFC. The Gold Coast today is seeing investment in a raft of areas, including, for example, having the forthcoming Commonwealth Games in 2018. We're now only a matter of weeks or months away from the 2014 Games, but there's a build-up of excitement around the Commonwealth Games and what it means for our city. We've seen consumer confidence become so much stronger than it was under the Australian Labor Party. We've seen property prices start to spur again, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we see Australians have more confidence that tomorrow is going to be a better day than today. And that's what was missing for the last 6 years. In other crucial parts of my constituency, Mr Deputy Speaker, we saw the ramifications in a negative sense, unfortunately, of poor Labor Party policy decisions. Labor closed down the Immigration Office on the Gold Coast. Now, the export of education was a big industry in my city, and Labor made it tougher by closing down the Immigration Office, with the consequence being that now if you were a student who was studying English, for example, or undertaking vocational studies on the Gold Coast and you're from abroad, you now have to travel to Brisbane in order to visit the Department of Immigration, which many are required to do on a regular and ongoing basis. Now, the challenge that we as a new government have, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm committed to reopening that office, is that we have been left with a multitude of debt, where we saw, for example, the last budget deficit being $47 billion. So I say to Gold Coasters and I say to my constituents, we will reopen that service, but it's going to take time, because I can't promise them and look them in the eye that we're going to open up all of these government services that Labor shut down, because we can't afford it, Mr Deputy Speaker. $47 billion worth of debt in the last budget alone means that we have to make some tough decisions to get that debt under control. But once it's under control, once we've got the reckless spending stopped, which this government has been focused on doing right from day one, then we'll have money and capital available once again to reopen services that we know are crucial to providing the support that crucial industries in my electorate, like the education export industry, need and deserve to continue going about making money, driving employment and driving exports of Australian services. Likewise, Mr Deputy Speaker, we saw the crazy decision of the Australian Labor Party to shut down the Australian Federal Police Office on the Gold Coast. Now, we saw, perhaps at its zenith about 12 months ago, the reputation of the Gold Coast getting trashed and tarnished almost on a daily basis in media. And Labor's solution was to close down the Federal Police Office on the Gold Coast, was to rip 40% out of the budget of the Australian Federal Police, because they had these ridiculous spending sprees of handing out $900 cheques to basically all and sundry, spending money on pink bats and then spending more money to rip them back out, failed schemes, of course, massive cost blowouts in so-called border protection policies, which cost some $11.5 billion, I think it was. So I've got to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that, and I make this solemn pledge to the people of the Gold Coast, we will get an AFP office back on the Gold Coast. I promise them that it will come back. But it's going to take time, because we've got to stop that reckless spending, we've got to restore our nation's finances, and by doing so, Mr Deputy Speaker, we'll have the money available to invest in delivering the safety and security that Australians, and in particular my constituency in Moncrieff, want and deserve. The state government stepped up to the plate, did an outstanding job. Through the so-called Vlad laws, we've seen bikies pushed out of our city and pushed out of our state, and with that, a lot of the crime, assaults, burglaries that are associated with it. I think the numbers are something like, from memory, Mr Deputy Speaker, a decline of some 40% in a number of areas, such as, for example, break-and-enters and assaults, since those laws came into effect. But I've got to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that apart from those positive plans to restore our city, the only reason that I have the privilege of standing in this chamber is because of the hard work of so many people involved in my campaign. Whether it's all the booth captains that did an outstanding job getting up, many of them at 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning to go and work the booths, whether it's those who were what we call our roving booth captains that made sure they filled any holes that existed in terms of the booth network. We had some 300 or 400 volunteers that were out on polling day playing their part to not only get me re-elected, but to make sure that we saw Tony Abbott installed as the new Prime Minister of Australia. So I've got to say it was a success, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to particularly mention, and it's always dangerous to do this, but I do want to particularly mention a couple of people, Mr Deputy Speaker. Peter Barlow, who did an outstanding job for me and has done so on numerous occasions as let's call him a special campaigner, who would stand on roundabouts and set up signage and those types of things for me for literally hours on end, for weeks on end, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to thank my campaign manager, Karen Embry, and the balance of my staff, Carly Abbott, Ben Dillaway, Gloria Vicario, Jack Piggott and Jake Durrington. All of them did an outstanding job in helping to steer my campaign and make sure that all aspects of my campaign, from the pre-polls through to the polling booths themselves, through to the postal votes, the mail-out campaign, that it all ran relatively smoothly. There were a couple of hiccups with the mail campaign, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it all ran relatively smoothly. And so I want to thank them in particular for the outstanding work that not only they did during the campaign, but thank my staff for the work that they do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that when I'm away, places like Canberra or travelling interstate, that there is always a presence and an open ear to the needs of my constituency and to deliver upon them. So I thank them. I want to, of course, thank my family, Mr Deputy Speaker, to my wife Astra and to my two boys, Asher and Tennyson, who sometimes through gritted teeth bear the frequent absences of their father and husband down here doing this job in Canberra. It is not an easy life, political life. The demands on your time are constant and consistent, and it is always, unfortunately, it is always family that loses out in that battle. I do what I can to maintain that balance, but I want to acknowledge and honour and love my family for the privilege that they provide me in letting me do this role in this chamber. So to my family, to my staff, to my friends, and to all the party members, I thank you all for your support over so many elections, and I'm grateful we were able to deliver a terrific outcome in Moncrieff, but importantly, and even more importantly, deliver a change of government here in Canberra. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary